Okay, some terms. Loops, patterns and cycles, and all names for short bits about a few seconds long that repeat themselves. BPM is beats per minute, FPS is frames per second. It could mean first person shooter, but right now it doesn't. BPM has an arguable average of 120, which is 2 beats per second, and is probably somewhere between 70 and 240. Also, music is kind of fractal, like a tune at 90 BPM and a tune at 180 BPM are kind of in time with each other. A lot of music is made with a click track or a drum machine or with a digital audio workstation, and therefore has a constant BPM which is known by the producer. Some isn't. Some is recorded by live musicians, and though you'd never know, it speeds up or slows down a few BPM over the course of the track. And some, obviously speeds up steadily over time and it's deliberate and that's fine, or slows down for that matter. FPS isn't quite as free. Silent film runs around 18 FPS. Film runs around 24. When the oldest surviving animated feature film, Prince Ahmed by Lotte Reiniger, was brought from 18 to 24 frames a second, an entire new soundtrack was composed. Apparently composing over an hour of music was cheaper back then than repeating every fourth frame. Traditional animation tends to use 2 frames the same unless things are moving really fast, so that's 12 frames per second most of the time, and then 24 when things are running fast. Television runs at 59.94 FPS in these parts of the world, and 50 in these parts of the world, and I'm going to be calling that 60 from now on, okay? But there's also interlacing. The screen is made up of 480 or 576 horizontal lines. On one frame you get these lines, on the next you get these lines. So, when you get films on TV here, it plays a frame for 2 frames, then the next frame for 3 frames. And if you watch a film on TV here, it's sped up from 24 to 25 frames a second, and you never noticed. And that includes VHS and DVD. You would, however, notice if every second a frame was repeated. That would look pretty awful. In music terms, that's a shift from 120 to 125 BPM. Animated GIFs average 10 frames a second, and VR needs at least 120 for you not to feel motion sickness. Have I missed any? Answer in the comments. And if I go into my animation program right now, I can type any FPS I like, and I can even make video files that change frame rate, but this is kind of a bad idea. They might change frame rate on that particular video file while you're playing it, but once you load it up to YouTube or whatever streaming service you happen to be using, it converts it to a single frame rate, and you really are just making life hard for yourself by attempting to do something like that, even though I did do a tutorial on it once. And cameras are not that flexible. A lot of them are locked to just a few FPS. The entirety of Android only does 30 FPS, even if you buy your Android phone in one of these parts of the world. And don't pretend phone cameras aren't good enough for you. Short answer, you're probably using 24, 25, 30, 50 or 60 frames a second, unless you're a mental. I animated Escape TV at 16 FPS. I refer you to my previous statement. Most music is in 4/4, which means 4 beats to the bar, and each of those beats is a quarter note long. Other common time signatures include 3/4 or the waltz, which is 3 quarter notes to the bar. Then there's 6/8 or the jig, which is 6 eighth notes, each eighth note being half the length of a quarter note. And it's kind of really 2 beats, but each beat is split into 3. Then there's 9/8 or the slip jig, which is 3 beats, each of which is split into 3. Sometimes you get 5/4, 5 beats to the bar. And yes, it can get just more and more and more complex than this. And yes, you can change time signature mid-song because musicians don't follow rules, man. If your time signature is more complicated than this, then you should probably sit down and explain it to your animator, and they'll probably understand it better than your guitarist. I'm going to leave it here except to say that if you fancy, you can call eighth notes quavers, quarter notes crotchets, half notes minims, whole notes semibreves, 16th note semiquavers, and 64th note hemi-demi semiquavers. And now I go on about Looney Tunes and then Chiptune. In traditional cell animation, you don't always draw the cells in the order they happen. Often you draw the extremes and then a halfway point, which is called the breakdown. And no, it's not really in the middle because things tend to move in arcs rather than straight lines. And then you do this halfway point and this halfway point, and then you do halves between all of those halfway points and so on. Drawing something at the halfway point is a lot easier than a third of the way across, which is in turn a lot easier than 2/5 of the way across. How do you make sure you're always splitting in two? Well, by placing your extremes every 8th frame, or if you're working at 24 frames a second, working at 160 BPM. In the 40s, all the Looney Tunes were being made, though not necessarily soundtracked, at 160 BPM. Meanwhile, Disney is running at 120 BPM, so it's running on like a 12 frame rather than an 8 frame system, which is like a little bit harder. It basically means that early on you need to do 2 breakdowns rather than 1. Why is this? According to Richard Williams, who, as he's basically an absolute animation guru, I ain't going to argue with, humans tend to walk at about 2 steps per second or 120 BPM. You know, my previous video went like oldest surviving animated feature film, Looney Tunes era, and now to 80s early computers, and this one's going to do the exact same, so I hope you're happy with that. So, Chiptune. It's music made on an old 80s computer or music that impersonates that. There's a load of limitations you get on that. Generally you get limited different synth sounds and you can only play a few notes at once. But what people generally fail to mention is you're actually limited in the BPMs that you can make the music in. You see, the easiest way to time the music is to have it triggered based on the frames. So like, okay, new frame, new note, except it's not quite like that. It's more like new note every 6 frames, new note every 5 frames. That would be speed 6 or speed 5. And at this point in history, you're running either at 60 frames per second or 50 frames per second, depending on where you are in the world. So here's a little chart of every speed setting you can use and what BPM it actually means. Oh, that assumes that there's 4 notes per beat. Which you might, okay, there may well be 3 notes per beat. You might be doing a diggly 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 kind of thing. So let's put this chart in as well. That's if there's 3 notes per beat, all the BPMs are subtly different. I think that's enough for now. Look, if you want to do like a different number of notes per beat, I think it's up to you, okay? And yes, you can change speed halfway through a tune. You might even be able to swap between 3 notes and 4 notes per beat while keeping the same BPM. Okay, present day. We're a mixture of animators and music producers who use digital audio workstations, meaning that our music runs at a constant BPM unless we don't want it to. And we're working together on a project. This is the chart that we're looking for. And it's based on this formula. Make sure you know what FPS you're using, because the chances are, if you're using a camera for some of it, you're obviously locked to a certain FPS. If we can make the music one of the BPMs in the chart under that FPS, then that's just going to make everybody's job a lot easier. Chances are we're not going to have to speed up or slow down our tune by a massive amount, not enough to notice. The difference between one and the next is not that great. In the description, there's a web page with all of these charts and formulas that I've been referring to earlier on it. Thank you for watching. This has been a back burner project for quite a while now.
So long, in fact, that some of it I did while I was recovering from brain surgery in hospital in Sheffield. Despite this, I think it's actually come out all right, and hopefully it actually makes sense. So
I'm starting a Patreon, but why? So I can justify the inordinate amount of time it takes me to make these videos. If you support me, you get all the files I use to make this and similar bits.
also been making shorter, quicker to make videos.
It will allow me to remake the lip sync for the Lazy series for 2.8 plus, and finally combine volume-based and phone-in-based lip sync. It'll allow me to expand the Perspective Trick series to look at single-point perspective in drawing, photography, 3D, gaming, rhythm, language, narrative, and musical instrument manufacture. Do you think that the fact that this video is essentially about getting music producers and animators to see things from each other's perspectives allows me to finish it with the theme? Perspective shift play. Perspective shift play.